I've got the S1H. I've technically had it for a day and a half. It showed up yesterday via FedEx from Lens Rentals. It's a rental. So I've had it for a day and a half, but basically 1 day's worth of shooting. I used it today on an actual project to see how it lived up to the workload. I'm very familiar with the GH5. I've had the GH5 basically since it came out, which has been, what, 3 or 4 years now. Also very familiar with the Ursa Mini, the Ursa Mini Pro, the Ursa Mini Pro G2. So whether it's hybrid shooting or cinema shooting, I'm very comfortable with both those systems. Shot with them a lot. I've also shot with Sony cameras, Canon cameras, you name it, I've probably played with it. And the S1H, which is right here, feels a lot like a GH5. Although, I will say, first thing I noticed, it sure is big and it sure is heavy compared to the GH5. Now granted, it's not as big as an Ursa Mini Pro. I'm not going to say that it is or that, it's ridiculously oversized, because it's not. But it's right at the point where I would say this is almost too big to hold in your hand for a hybrid. It's right at the edge. And granted, I don't have the biggest hands. I'm sure if you have giant hands, this feels a lot better. But the grip is very deep and it is very heavy. It's a full frame camera, as it should be. But if you're used to the GH5 and you've been used to Micro Four Third and you're looking to upgrade to full frame, the S1H is not like the Sony cameras. Sony, in my opinion, with the A7S and A7S II, make very small cameras. They feel tiny. The S1H in comparison feels massive and gigantic. Is it something you would get used to? Absolutely. Most things based on ergonomics, you do adapt to. You do just becomes normal and it feels the way it feels. But if you're coming from a GH5 or any kind of mid-size mirrorless camera, the S1H is a lot of camera. And with the 24-70 lens that I have on here, it's quite heavy and would be exhausting to hold all day long. Now, granted, it has internal stabilization, so that can help if you do get a little shaky throughout the day. And I'm talking about, I've shot all day with the Ursa Mini Pro, which is even heavier than this. So again, this isn't to the point of exhaustion where the S1H is impossible to hold. But compared to a GH5, you're probably going to have a lot easier time just holding and moving around with a GH5 in a more comfortable way, considering a GH5 with a 12 to 35 is half this size, half the weight probably. I don't know exactly, but it is noticeable and something that I would just point out right away. Don't expect this to feel the same or be pocketable, but none of them really are pocketable. I don't know whose pockets are that big anyway, but definitely not the S1H. The next thing I noticed about the S1H is this mushy shutter button. So the trigger here, most cameras will have a click. The GH5 has a click when you pull the shutter and you release the shutter. It clicks, the button clicks. So you have a little bit of a haptic feedback to know that you've taken the photo. Even if you're in the silent mode, the button itself still has a click, a mechanical click. The S1H doesn't have that. It's got this kind of mushy button that, did you press it halfway? Did you press it all the way down? It doesn't really click back to you to know that you've taken the photo. This is fixed if you have it in, the loud mode, and not that it's really loud, but just not silent. If you put this camera in silent, it's really hard to tell you're even taking pictures other than the frame blacks out briefly, so you know something was snapped. But other than that, there's no real feedback to the shooter to know, hey, a picture was captured. And it's kind of hard to know exactly when the photo is captured when the screen's blanking out as well, because you don't actually see the photo that was captured because it's black. Now, if you have the sound on and you get that click from the sound that's made by the camera to resonate that a photo has been taken, that is a lot better. And it's a nice way to shoot so you know that you got what you wanted to capture photography-wise. And also, too, there are many times where I was recording video where I would push the button, both the record button up at the top and the shutter button, both feel the exact same. They're just kind of mushy, and it's a little underwhelming to click because you always have to second guess. Is it starting recording? And then you look for the red dot and you look, okay, yes, it is recording. Did I stop recording? Make sure there's no red dot on the screen, and then, okay, you've stopped recording. It's a minor little nitpick, but I wanted to go through all the things that caught me off guard as being kind of irritating or frustrating and things you would have to get used to that seem relatively unique to the S1H. The other thing that felt kind of weird right off the bat is on the back of the camera, you have the menu button, which on the GH5, again, a lot of this is what you're used to and what you feel, what feels right. But I imagine a lot of people looking at the S1H would be coming from the GH5. Anyway, on the GH5, the menu button is kind of depressed. So there's a nice little groove to where your thumb sits and it feels like it just nestles right in there. On the S1H, it's almost protruding, so it kind of bubbles up a little bit, and this feels very odd to find a good place for your thumb to rest. Again, I'm sure you would get used to it over time, but it did catch me off guard as feeling kind of odd and weird. And the menu button in general is just kind of, it feels kind of finicky and not quite as sturdy as other camera systems where you know the tactile function of what you want to happen is happening. Up is up, left is left, right is right, down is down. The menu set on this it doesn't feel quite right in the same way. Also, in terms of the mushy shutter and how things get recorded, on the LCD screen, the record icon is in the bottom left-hand corner, which is, again, very different from the GH5, which is in the top right. So many times I found myself looking at the top right, going like, why am I not recording? And then having to remind myself, oh, it's in the bottom left. You would definitely get used to this over time. It would become second nature and habit. But it is odd because it seems like it's in an odd place. I'm sure there's some camera systems out there that put the record, in the top left or the bottom left or the top right or the bottom right. But just in general, it felt like it's like the total opposite corner of what I'm used to. And it's going to take a little bit to get used to it if I end up sticking with this camera for the long term. This one was a little odd. So on the side here, this card door, first of all, it has a release button. So again, I'm comparing it to the GH5 because that's the reference point. I'm sure a lot of people have shot with it. The card door on the GH5 just pops open. You just pull it and it pops. On the S1H, you have to release this lever and then pull it the same way, which is kind of, you're going two different directions. You're pulling the button one way and then pushing the card door another way. This can be a challenging maneuver, or at least slightly irritating. Probably would get used to it, but it is an extra movement that I imagine keeps the card door a little bit more secure, but I've never had a problem with that on the GH5, so I don't know why we need a latch here. I think it should just pull and pop like most cameras. Anyway, that's not the main issue with the card door. The main issue with the card door is this kind of clasp here for where you'd put the neck strap that you loop through here, which I don't usually shoot video with a neck strap because it just kind of gets in the way. If I was traveling and doing photography and I wanted to take a break from the heavy camera, I would probably have the neck strap on there just so I didn't have to hold the camera the whole time. But with video, it often just gets in the way, so I usually take it off. But anyway, with this can easily flip down and then get in the way of the card door. Hopefully you can see that, of where it just, the clasp blocks the door. So you have to do this maneuver where you flip this up and then you can close it again. Minor design inconvenience, but I did think it was weird that this was not, not tested, because that easily, it naturally wants to rest down and then it's always in the way and you have to move this to close this. These are super nitpicky things, but they're things that I want you to know because you probably know all the great things about this camera. You know all the good stuff that it can do, all the stuff I knew before getting it. But that's why I think renting is so valuable, because you get to see all this kind of nitpicky stuff that you're like, oh, wow, that's kind of weird. I wonder why they did that. Next, good to know is that the 4K 60 mode, it's called out in the specs, but a reminder is that it is 420 if that matters to you. There is a 10-bit 4K 60 mode, but the color sampling is 422. Not the hugest thing, but it is good to know that when you're going through all the menu options for all the different frame rates and bit rates and the codecs, there are all these little tiles, and each combination is its own tile. So there's actually some crazy amount of codecs and frame rate options on here, and you have to scroll through all of them to get to each other. So you could be scrolling and looking for one very specific codec, and you might go right by it, or you forget where it's at. You can set like kind of favorites and filter down the list, but just going from the quick menu and going through, there are a lot of different codecs on here, which is great. There's a lot of variety, but just the menu needs an update. The way Lumix, Panasonic have been doing these menus on the GH5 and the S1H is just getting out of hand. They really need to separate resolution into its own choice. Pick, do you want 4K? Do you want 6K? Do you want 1080? Separate frame rate into its own choice. Do you want 23,976? Do you want 30? Do you want 60? Do you want 120? What frame rate do you want? And then how do you want that recorded? Do you want it, 10-bit, 8-bit, all I? Have that as a separate choice as well. This is exactly how Blackmagic has done it on their menus, and those menus are fantastic. More cameras need that same functionality where you're picking these things independently. There's no reason resolution, frame rate, and the recording format and the codec all have to be tied into one setting, and then you end up with, theoretically, an infinite number of combinations. The more frame rates, the more resolutions, the more codec options they're putting into these cameras. It just makes the menus really kind of irritating to navigate and something that you should know. Also good to know about the S1H as a reminder, which you probably already do, but just as a reminder, 4K 60 is a Super 35 crop of full frame. There isn't a 4K 60 mode that is full frame. So if you bought the S1H thinking that you were going to get full frame 4K 60, well, that's not an option. It's only Super 35 or APS-C. Those are relatively equivalent. Now, this is bigger sensor format than the GH5, which is Micro Four Thirds, which is another step smaller than Super 35. But with a speed booster, that puts the field of view right up there at Super 35 on the GH5. So theoretically, if you wanted this just for 4K 60, thinking you're gonna get full frame, you can get the same 4K 60 with the GH5 and a speed booster. So just keep that in mind, because it is something that can kind of sneak in there that it's not full frame 4K 60. Next up, you'll notice full frame rolling shutter is a problem on the S1H. Just panning the camera back and forth and doing a little wiggle test, you can see the jello, you can see the wobbly lines. If you're in Super 35 mode with a faster frame rate, it does go away a little bit and it's reduced, but full frame 4K, like it's got to read that sensor fast, and it's not as fast as you might like because you do get that rolling shutter effect. Something that's probably not a deal breaker because most hybrid shooters have kind of gotten used to this over the years, but if for whatever reason that's a really important factor for how you shoot, do know that the rolling shutter can be severe in high action scenes where there's a lot of movement happening. If things are more calm, you're probably not going to notice it all that much. The battery charger. This is something else that kind of caught me off guard. Again, super nitpicky, but you have the battery, which the battery is, much, much larger than the GH5 batteries. So you've got a big battery on here, and it clips right into the charger as you would expect. But then the charger is USB-C, which is nice and handy that you could plug that into a laptop or some other kind of power adapter. But then it goes into this box, which then goes into your standard, plug for the wall. So the fact that you have two boxes is a little off-putting, considering most battery chargers you're probably familiar with are a box and a cord that goes in the wall. If they had to do this to convert, I understand, but I probably would have preferred being able to plug this cord in here and then a separate one for the USB-C. It's nice that you can charge off a USB-C, but just keep in mind you get one of these situations, which is similar to what the Aperture 120D battery bricks are kind of like, or power boxes are like. It's just a lot of cords, a lot of boxes, and a lot of connections that if you lose one cable or you lose one box, the whole thing's kind of shot. So just a heads up. However, all these things considered, the footage is beautiful. Okay, compared to the GH5, it is very, very nice. Much better dynamic range. The color and the smoothness of the color, specifically in skin tones, is quite pleasing. The content I was filming today was shot in camera with a picture profile baked in. This was a project that wasn't going to benefit from the process of shooting log and then having to color grade. It's kind of a fast turnaround thing, so we wanted to get the look right in camera. I ended up going with the landscape picture profile for this one, just because that looked nicest for what we were shooting on the LCD monitor, and I was blown away by how good it looked in the computer after the fact. The skin tones were really nice, and if you've shot with the GH5 before, it is 4K and it does all these amazing things. But one thing with the GH4 and the GH5 that has always kind of not really bugged me, but it's been there as like, it's a subjective thing. The footage has kind of like a texture to it. Some people might call it noise or grain, but there's definitely a distinct like texture to the footage that isn't super smooth and glossy. I don't know a better way to describe it other than texture, because it's not really noise. You can shoot with a low ISO and it'll still be there. With the S1H, I didn't notice that at all. The same kind of perceptible texture that you get with the GH5 is not on this camera. I have to do some more shooting to see if it comes up or if it's, you know, something that maybe I'm just not paying attention to. But I did notice right away just how smooth and clean the footage looked while still being very, very detailed. Am I pixel peeping at it and putting charts up? No, we were shooting footage for our project, so it looked really, really nice, and I shot everything at 4K. I didn't go 6K. I shot a combination of the 10-bit stuff and the 8-bit stuff, again, for that kind of flexibility of like higher quality color in the one situation, but then maybe the ease of use and the speed and efficiency of 8-bit. And again, having the 4K 60 at 8-bit is just a little bit easier to edit. So I really, really did like the footage. However, the LCD screen on the S1H is pretty terrible, I would say, by today's standards. It's basically looks like the same screen or very similar to the one that's on the GH5. The menu and everything are very, very similar. And just the way everything's laid out and the color and sharpness of the LCD is not all that great. In fact, when I was looking at it on the camera, I was kind of underwhelmed at how it looked. I was just like, oh, that's kind of okay. Once I got the footage into the computer, it looked much, much better. So thankfully, what you're capturing is great. But if you're expecting to kind of see on the back LCD something beautiful and breathtaking and, oh my gosh, this is so incredibly gorgeous, you kind of have to save that satisfaction for later when you're actually in editing and you bring it into Premiere or you open it up with QuickTime and you see what you actually shot in all its glory. Now, if you had an external recorder, monitor, display on set, that would probably help so that that screen is taking the burden of being the eye candy. But the little LCD on the back is this, you know, kind of tiny little typical GH5 screen that's not really going to blow you away, I don't think. At least me, I was a little underwhelmed with the LCD screen, but loved the footage after the fact. So I don't know that I have any strong conclusions one way or the other. There was a lot of stuff about the S1H that was kind of a turn-off at first. But again, I think a lot of that is just me being in the GH5 system for so long that all the things that feel familiar and then them not being there on the S1H and the size and the weight and everything about it being a little bit different or kind of clunky compared to the GH5 was off-putting at first. But then once I saw the footage, I was very, very pleased with what had been shot. And I'm pretty sure I didn't do a side-by-side with the GH5 because, again, this was a real project we were working on. So I didn't have time to do side-by-side test footage of S1H versus GH5 with the exact same lenses or lens equivalents and try and get them matchy-matchy and see which one looked better. But at a glance, after the first day of filming with it, being very underwhelmed with the hardware and the design, not very underwhelmed, but just the minor gripes that I pointed out before, and kind of filming with it and being like, yeah, I don't need this camera. The GH5 is fine. And then seeing the footage, I was like, oh, wait, no, this camera is really, really cool. One person I'll call out is Dustin Armstrong. If you've never seen his channel, I would recommend checking it out. He has a lot of stuff on the S1H. He's been shooting with it far longer than I have, so he probably has a little bit more insight to the ins and outs of it. I just wanted to call it out because I've been watching some of his content just to kind of get a better understanding and make sure I'm not missing anything on the S1H. I do like just having hands on the camera, again, renting it rather than feeling like, oh, you've got to watch these videos and make a purchase decision on a $4,000 camera right now, plus this lens is another $2,000. That's a lot of money to put on something that, you know, may not be everything you want or hope or expect. Hopefully this can be a little bit more insight and a little bit of value to you if you're looking at the S1H or something similar. I think this camera would be a more obvious contender if it were cheaper at this point in time. $4,000 is incredibly affordable for everything this does, but it's also starting to look a little bit expensive compared to the R5 and the A7S III. And there are a few features like the slow-mo 4K that I kind of wish maintained that full frame characteristic. You buy a full frame camera to have full frame, and so for them to have a Super 35 mode for the 4K 60 is a little disappointing. Super 35 work? Yeah, absolutely. The Ursa Mini Pro is Super 35. It looks great. The GH5 with the speed booster is essentially Super 35. It looks great. When you have full frame though, you kind of want it to be full frame. So it makes things like the A7S III look a little bit nicer by comparison. Plus you get higher frame rates there. So just something to keep in mind. Although I will say I expect the S1H, this thing is built like a tank. Again, I said it's big and it's heavy, but I also imagine it would withstand a lot of pressure and stress. There's fans in this camera on the side here. There's a vent and behind the LCD, which makes it kind of awkward on the back here. Like this raised LCD not being flush with the back is kind of an odd thing design-wise. I understand why they did it so that the camera didn't overheat, but it is a little odd aesthetically to have kind of like a back block that hangs out for where the LCD goes. Supposedly it is weather sealed and the fan and vents are separate, so that has been a concern about, you know, dust or moisture getting into the camera through these vents and the fan. Apparently that's not an issue, but I don't actually know that 100%. Probably something to look into just to make sure, but that's what I've heard against that specific criticism. Other than that, I'm really pleased to have the camera in hand and again for it to be a rental so that I can test it and get my hands on it and not feel that kind of buyer's remorse or that guilt of feeling like I have to love it because I bought it. I feel like, you know, it's a situation where you can be a little bit more honest and critical of the device when it is just a rental. You can see what you love and what you hate. And so far, I don't hate anything. Everything's just been kind of minor irritations that most of them you probably would get used to. But I do really love how the footage is looking so far. And I have to do more tests with Vlog. Thankfully, the S1H is Vlog, not Vlog L. On the GH4 and GH5, it was the Vlog Lite or Little or Lame mode, whatever you want to call it. But basically like a toned down version of Vlog that's just not quite all that great the way that Panasonic implemented it. So I'm glad to see proper Vlog. This is the same Vlog that's in the VariCam. So, you know, for thousands and thousands of dollars for a cinema camera, you can spend, you know, 3 to 4, depending on where the price lands on this in the next little bit, or if you buy it used, right? Then you're getting a lot of horsepower in a hybrid camera that I should say does a decent job with the autofocus. I know that's one of Panasonic's main points of contention that most people bring up, that the autofocus is terrible and In photo mode, it works great. Is it as good as a Sony or a Canon? I can't say because I haven't shot with their latest and greatest, but it has eye tracking. It has animal tracking. Is it as good? Maybe not, but in the test I was doing, it was performing remarkably well for photos. In video, wasn't quite the same level of quality, but it did seem to be an improvement for me over the GH5 in autofocus tests I've done in the past with the GH5. I have to do more because it is one of those things like different situations present different problems for the system. I will say, if you are far away from the subject, it will have a harder time recognizing a face or an eye, whereas if you're closer, something like this setup here where there's a clear giant face in the frame and there's eyes, it does a lot better. So it's situational, it depends, but I wouldn't write it off as if it's like garbage. You can definitely do the eye tracking, autofocus for photography, even at shallow, f-stops like 2.8 is what I was testing with the 24-70. I do have an adapter to modify some EF lenses, so Canon EF lenses. There's a smart adapter that Sigma makes. I believe it's the MC11 that adapts Canon EF lenses to the L mount, which is what this is. It's the Leica Panasonic Sigma mirrorless mount, the L mount. Adapters are not known for their reliability in terms of autofocus. So I feel like that's a little unfair to test the 85 Canon EF lens. And it's not even that great of one. It's the Yongnuo really cheap 85mm lens. But it's still a fun lens to play around with because a lot of those lenses that are really cheap are kind of the easy no-brainers to just have in a bag because you're not too worried about, losing this $2,000 lens or spending all this money getting the perfect one. It's like, okay, I'll test that out, see how it goes, and have some fun with it. It's kind of my like travel lens I bring, when it's just taking pictures of the family and whatnot for social media or just like family photos, that kind of thing. Don't have to worry about, some one of the kids bumping it or knocking it or getting it dirty because it's a cheap lens. And I kind of like having those in the bag, just some cheap stuff that doesn't really matter. Although I wouldn't test and kind of go by the autofocus of it, considering the lens is a cheap lens and then I'm adapting it from EF to L. So the 24-70 proper L mount lens, I wanted to make sure I had on this as a proper autofocus test. And I'm happy to say it works fairly well. So all things considered, stabilization works great. I didn't notice anything like weird or off-putting about the stabilization, nor did I notice it being like exceptionally great either, but Panasonic is known for good IBIS, so I'll call it out if I notice anything, but it has it and it works. It's got the flip screen, it's got the bigger battery. Basically everything that you would want spec-wise is here, although it just is slightly compromised on certain things like that 4K 60 mode being Super 35, that being unfortunate, or the 6K mode only being 8-bit. But again, that might be a benefit to you depending on your system and what you're editing with. Of course, I should mention the S1H does anamorphic, which is a fairly unique thing. This is on all the marketing materials that it shoots anamorphic, much like that's a very cinema camera feature. Most hybrids don't. In fact, I can't think of many other than the GH5 that also offer proper anamorphic support. So they've really thought about all the features video professionals would want. So if you are looking for a hybrid, definitely consider the S1H. For me, I don't know. It's not a day one must have, like I love this camera so much I can't give it back. It's more of a, I'll see how things go. But I do really like the footage I'm getting out of it. I have to take the photos in, edit the photos, see those, high resolution, check those out. I will probably have some actual footage and photo samples to go through once I'm actually done. It's just weeding through all the cards and photos and getting rid of some of the junk, keeping the good stuff, and then keeping some of the junk as good examples of maybe where the autofocus missed or something that just didn't turn out all that well because of the situation I was in. So more to come, but that's my day one impressions of the LUMIX S1H.